Hey everyone, this lesson is going to be on blood components and the functions of these different components. This first slide that we're taking a look at here, what it does show at the top, the red blood cells, the platelets, and white blood cells. They are what is referred to as the formed elements of blood. And you can kind of think of these formed elements as being things that you can see underneath the microscope using a light microscope. And these three things, the red blood cells, the platelets, and the white blood cells, they are floating around in the liquid or fluidy portion of the blood. And that is referred to as the plasma, the fluidy portion of the blood. As we'll see, it has other functions in addition to just transporting around these formed elements. So we'll talk about the function of the plasma, the function of the red blood cells, the platelets, and just very briefly on the white blood cells, because we'll come back a little bit later and in another lesson I'll talk about specifically in more detail the function of the white blood cells. The red blood cells and the white blood cells, they also do have some other more scientific, more technical names. The red blood cells are also referred to as erythrocytes, which really does just mean red cells. Erythro is red, erythrocytes, red cells. And the white blood cells, they are also referred to as leukocytes, which does just mean white cells or white blood cells. Now, keep in mind as well that all of these are floating around inside of your blood vessels. The blood vessels themselves are made up of cells. So if I just sort of try and draw on here, the lining of the blood vessel that we've cut into here, it's made up of individual cells that are usually fairly tightly connected together. And that's kind of what keeps the blood, the formed elements, and the plasma inside of the blood vessels. I'll start by mentioning that all of these different formed elements in the blood, whether it is the red blood cells, the white blood cells, or the platelets, all of these are produced in your bone marrow. Typically, the bone marrow of your longer or larger bones, so that includes your femur bones, your upper leg bones, your thigh bones, and also your pelvis, fairly large bones, and that's where most of these blood cells are going to be produced. So inside of the bone marrow, there are what are referred to as stem cells. You can think of stem cells as being a reservoir to replace cells in your body that need to be replaced for various different reasons. Either they are dying or they just need to be replaced, perhaps because they have been lost in the case of blood, if there is some blood loss due to bleeding or hemorrhaging. So these stem cells, they are what are referred to as undifferentiated cells. They themselves do not have a specific function other than to produce other cell types which do have a specific function. So again, it doesn't matter if it is the red blood cells, all of the different kinds of white blood cells that we can see here, or whether it is the platelets, all of these are going to be produced in the bone marrow. This picture here on the left is what you would see if you are giving blood, if they take blood to do some testing on it. So it's put into a test tube, and of course it's this kind of reddish color. All blood is red in color. There is no blue blood. So blood that is high in oxygen does have a brighter red color than blood that is low in oxygen. But both of them are going to be red in color. There is no blue blood. If you do allow this blood to settle over time or put it in what's called a centrifuge, things that are heavier will settle down toward the bottom, and things that are lighter will be closer to the top. So what this does allow us to do is kind of separate out the red blood cells, which are the heaviest, they settle down to the bottom, from the white blood cells and the platelets, which form this fairly small intermediate band, and then sitting on top, the lightest of them all, but as we'll see, what typically makes up most of the blood is going to be the liquidy portion, or again, the plasma of the blood, and we can see here that it's kind of a pale yellowish color. So let's talk about the red blood cells first of all, and the shape of the red blood cells. So we've talked already a few times about structure-function relationship, and in particular about surface area and how increasing the surface area typically leads to an increase in efficiency. When red blood cells are first formed in your bone marrow, they do have a nucleus, but mature red blood cells, they have no nucleus. They are the only cells in your body that don't actually have a nucleus. There's a little bit of a trade-off here. As we'll see, that does make the red blood cells more efficient, but what it also means is they have a finite lifetime. So the nucleus, of course, has the genetic information. That genetic information is relied upon in order to provide instructions to make proteins, and what that means is that a cell that has no nucleus can no longer have any protein synthesis that is taking place. And for that reason, red blood cells, they do only live for, on average, somewhere around 120 days. And for that reason, they do need to be replaced, and they do need to be replaced continuously. And again, that is going to be from the stem cells in the bone marrow. There's a hormone that's going to lead to the production of, it's going to tell the bone marrow to produce the red blood cells, and that hormone is what is called erythropoietin. It's produced by the kidneys. Erythropoietin, or EPO, is going to tell the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. So back to the shape of the red blood cells, because they have lost their nucleus, they are no longer spherical. Instead, what they have is what is referred to as a biconcave shape. So if we do take a look at this red blood cell that is at the left here, we can see that in the center, it's a little bit lighter in color, and the reason why it's lighter in color is because it is thinner in the middle compared to around the perimeter. So this shape where it is pinched in on either side, that is the biconcave. It's not just on one side, it is on both sides. So if we take this red blood cell that's on the left and kind of turn it 90 degrees, cut into it, then we can see this sort of biconcave shape. So now looking into it, this would be the thinner portion here toward the center, thicker around the outside. So it's sort of like a donut, but the hole doesn't go right through. So not only does it cave in on one side, it caves in on both sides, and that's why it's not just concave, but it is biconcave in terms of its shape. Well, what's the significance to this biconcave shape? Well, by losing the nucleus and by forming this biconcave shape, what it does is it will greatly increase the surface area. So the function of red blood cells is, well, kind of twofold. The main function of the red blood cells is going to be to transport oxygen, transport O2, but also when it does give up the oxygen, what it's going to do is pick up and transport carbon dioxide as well. So it does in fact transport both of those. That is how the vast majority of oxygen is transported in your body, is inside of the red blood cells. So in order for the oxygen to get inside of the red blood cells, what we want to do is maximize the surface area to make that process more efficient. So if I just redraw the red blood cell again, sort of taking a look at an end view of it, and this kind of a peanut shape or biconcave shape, it's inside of the red blood cell where you do have the molecules which are going to be responsible for transporting the oxygen. And these molecules that are responsible for transporting the oxygen, they are called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin for transporting oxygen, and when the oxygen is given up, for transporting carbon dioxide as well. A huge number of hemoglobin molecules inside each and every one of your red blood cells, and it's somewhere on the order of about 250 million of these inside of every single one of your red blood cells, and you have about 25 trillion red blood cells in your body. So huge ability to transport oxygen, but that oxygen does need to get inside of the red blood cells. So oxygen here needs to get to the inside. The way that it gets inside is by crossing. It can diffuse. It is one of the things that can actually diffuse right across the cell membrane. So the larger that cell membrane is, the more oxygen can get to the inside, and the more oxygen can then bind to the hemoglobin and be transported by your red blood cells. So a little bit more about the red blood cells and about the hemoglobin. So again, this picture here does just kind of show that yes, it is the oxygen. And keep in mind that, well, this is one of the two functions really of your respiratory system. So you breathe the oxygen into your lungs. It's then going to diffuse out of the alveoli of your lungs, diffuse into the plasma, and diffuse into the red blood cells. So this is showing an individual red blood cell and inside the hemoglobin molecules. But again, keep in mind, it's not just the small number that they're showing here, but it is millions upon millions of hemoglobin molecules. So that oxygen is then going to be delivered to your cells, which will then use it for cellular respiration. And in turn, the carbon dioxide that is produced can also be picked up by the hemoglobin. But it is showing at the right-hand side, this is where we do reach the tissue level and when the cells are, or where the red blood cells are going to give up that oxygen. So we did see this previously where we do have the exchange of gases in the lungs that then goes into your blood. This is what we call external respiration. And when we do have the exchange of gases at the tissue level, we call this one internal respiration. This slide is showing us a representation of the hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a protein. It's actually made up of 4 different subunits, 2 what are called the alpha subunits and 2 of the beta subunits. Each one of these is able to bind 4 different molecules of oxygen. So if we have 250 million of these inside every single one of your red blood cells, that means that each red blood cell can transport 1 billion molecules of oxygen. But what it's showing on the right-hand side here as well is something that you certainly don't need to know the molecular structure of, but what you should be aware of is central to the hemoglobin and central to the ability to transport oxygen is the element iron. So iron in your diet, this is one of the functions of iron in your diet, is to be able to make the hemoglobin and make the red blood cells and to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. So what does that mean if you're not getting enough iron in your diet? Well, perhaps you can't make as many of this heme group. You can't make as much as the hemoglobin. You can't make as many red blood cells. You can't transport as much oxygen, and that's sometimes referred to the condition called anemia. The blood may actually be pale in color because there simply aren't quite as many red blood cells. The overall percentage of red blood cells would be considerably lower than what it normally is. So just to finish off with the red blood cells, going back to where they are produced, which is in the bone marrow, the stem cells of the bone marrow. Again, there's a hormone that's going to stimulate these. That hormone is EPO or erythropoietin, which is coming from the kidneys. There are an enormous number of these red blood cells that are dying, somewhere on the order of about 2 million per second. Which means, of course, if 2 million are dying every second, 2 million do have to be replaced every second as well. There are a number of things that can have an influence on the number of red blood cells that you do have. So typically, as we'll see, it'll make somewhere around, in terms of the blood volume, somewhere around, well, 40 to 50% of your blood volume is coming from the red blood cells. So if we were to take a look at this volume right here, somewhere on the order of 40 to 50%, sometimes this is referred to as the hematocrit. Hematocrit of 40 or 45 or 50. So this is a normal sort of range. Quite often females might be a little bit closer to the lower range, males a little bit closer to the upper range, but a number of other things can have an influence on the percentage of red blood cells. We already mentioned one of them, so perhaps a lack of iron in the diet might lead to a decreased production and decreased percentage of red blood cells, but there are a number of other things as well, other things in particular that can increase the number of red blood cells. So keep in mind the function of red blood cells overall, the main function is to transport oxygen and get that oxygen to your cells. So if your cells are not getting enough oxygen, they are going to try to encourage the body to do something to get more oxygen to those cells in order for the oxygen to be used for cellular respiration. So what that might mean is bumping up the number of red blood cells, increasing the number of red blood cells. So why might there not be enough oxygen getting to the cells? Well, there are a couple of reasons why the amount of oxygen might be lower than normal. One of them might just simply be that there isn't as much oxygen available in that particular environment. So if someone, for example, is living at altitude, overall, it's exactly the same percentage of gases in the atmosphere, and the major gas in the atmosphere is N2, nitrogen. It's somewhere on the order of about 78%. Oxygen is the second most common gas in the atmosphere, and it's somewhere on the order of, well, 20 to 21%. I'll put 20% here. At altitude, it is the same percentage. The difference is that overall the amount of gas is going to go down. So because there is less oxygen that is available at altitude, that means there's less oxygen that's being transported to your cells. So there's going to be a message that's going to be going to your bone marrow, and that's going to say, go ahead and make more red blood cells. So someone that is living at altitude, in order to, a really important word, compensate, in order to compensate for a lack of oxygen in the atmosphere, the kidneys will produce that hormone that I mentioned, EPO, erythropoietin. It'll go to the bone marrow and it'll say, make more red blood cells. There's less available, but your cells still need the same amount. So let's make more red blood cells to get that oxygen delivered to your cells. So altitude, that's kind of a big one. Another one is athletics. So athletes, endurance athletes in particular, will have an increased number of red blood cells. So exercise, in fact, and in particular aerobic exercise, so things like long distance swimming, running, cycling, cross-country skiing, those are aerobic exercises, endurance exercises, kind of similar to what we saw. The body is again compensating for something, but in this case it's not the lack of oxygen, it's that when the muscles are exercising, they're not getting enough oxygen, so same thing happens. EPO is going to be produced, that's going to tell the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells to compensate for that lack of oxygen for the muscles when that individual is exercising. So staying with the theme of exercise, sometimes athletes do some things that are, well, not exactly legal. So one of which is blood doping. That is something that can increase the number of red blood cells. And this one here, EPO, it is a hormone that is naturally produced by your body, but it also happens to be a drug, a pharmaceutical that is made through genetic engineering. And that is something that is available to people that do have kidney dysfunctions and cannot make the EPO, but that is also something that athletes could get a hold of and use to enhance their athletic performance by increasing their number of red blood cells. So that's pretty much it for the red blood cells, and very little to say about these ones here, the white blood cells or the leukocytes. And again, the reason why there's so little to say about it right now is because there will be another lesson which is dealing strictly with these and the immune system, the immune response. So that is the function, is the immune system, and what that really means is it's to fight off invaders. So by these invaders, what I'm really talking about are different kinds of infections or pathogens, things that could potentially cause some harm that get inside of your body that shouldn't be inside of your body. So think of things like bacteria, fungi, viruses. It's the white blood cells that are going to defend and protect your body when they do gain entrance into your body. So unlike the red blood cells, these ones here, they do all have a nucleus. They were produced once again in the bone marrow. These ones have a nucleus, they maintain their nucleus. Certainly if the person is sick and fighting off some sort of invaders or infection, these numbers will go up. If the person is not sick, these numbers will go down. So just like the red blood cells, these ones can fluctuate as well, depending upon the health of the individual. So I have here 5 different kinds of white blood cells, but I'm just going to kind of focus on the 2 most common ones. So chances are, if you look underneath a microscope and you see a white blood cell, chances are it's this one right here, which is a neutrophil, since if we take a look at the percentages, 60 to 70% of your white blood cells are in fact the neutrophils. The way you tell the difference between these is by looking at the nucleus. And this one here, if I just kind of redraw it, and I'm going to draw it in blue here because the stain that we do use, it's the nucleus that is actually staining. So in the case of the neutrophils, I'm just going to draw a really rough sketch here for what the nucleus might look like. It doesn't always look like this, but the key is that it has kind of an odd-shaped nucleus, and in fact, it might look like there are several different nuclei, but there aren't. There is just one, and they are all connected together. There is a cell membrane on the outside. Sometimes it's kind of faint and difficult to see, but this might be the shape of a neutrophil, and just kind of keep in mind that it does have the odd-shaped nucleus. The other one, which is the lymphocytes, again, the nucleus, it's going to stain a blue or a purple color. What you want to look for this one is that it has a large nucleus that fills up almost the entire cell. In this case, sometimes it's difficult to see the cell membrane because the cell membrane is pretty much right adjacent to the nuclear membrane, but big round spherical nucleus, and that's a pretty good indication that that one is going to be a neutrophil. So the next one that we'll go on to is the platelets. And the platelets are involved in sealing off blood vessels when blood vessels are ruptured. So we can see this picture at the left here that we do have a blood vessel. So if I just kind of highlight using red here, this is the lining of the blood vessel. This is the lining of the blood vessel that we're showing at the top here, and it's showing that that blood vessel is ruptured. If I just quickly go back here to one of our previous slides, in fact, the very first one that's showing the different formed elements in the blood. Make note also, we are taking a look at how the structure is related to the function. So we saw how red blood cells, their structure was related to their function. For the white blood cells, what do? Well, they fight off infections. So for one thing, sort of take a look at the size for size comparison. Take a look at the size of the red blood cell compared to the size of the white blood cell. Bacteria are typically about 1/10 the size of a white blood cell. Viruses are even smaller. And it's just kind of nice if you're trying to destroy things if you're bigger. Also, you kind of want to make sure that you're destroying what you should be destroying and not destroying your own cells. So kind of think of this nucleus as saying, yeah, I know what I'm looking for. It's this. I can identify that as being foreign, and then I'm going to destroy it. So in terms of the size, though, if we take a look at it, the platelets, as we can see here, this isn't necessarily exactly to scale, but they certainly are much, much smaller than both the white blood cells and the red blood cells. So what are these platelets actually doing, and how do they aid in sealing off a blood vessel when that blood vessel has been ruptured? Well, when the blood vessel is ruptured, there is underlying tissue underneath, and it's that underlying tissue that's underneath of the red blood cell that's exposed. And when that is exposed, that's going to be sort of the cue for what it's showing here in yellow. Those are the platelets. So those platelets, they are going to stick to this underlying tissue. They might trap in along with them some red blood cells and some platelets. So if we take a look at this picture here, we can see that we have some platelets that have sealed off the blood vessel that was ruptured. It's trapped some red blood cells along with it, and it would probably be some white blood cells that would be trapped in here as well. So what we have at this point is what is referred to as a platelet plug, and it is really kind of a temporary measure. So it seals off the blood vessel, but it's kind of rough and dirty. What you want to do is you want to strengthen it, and then eventually you do want to repair and replace that damaged blood vessel. So when those platelets do stick to that underlying tissue, what they're also going to do is they're going to rupture, they're going to become activated, and they're going to release what are called some clotting factors. So this is not only now going to lead to a platelet plug, it is going to lead to a clot. So we have a number of different biochemical reactions that are taking place. We have the activation of thrombin, which is going to activate the fibrin, and you can think of these fibrin as being strands of very, very thin and strong fibers. So the difference between the picture on the right and the center one is now we have all of these fibrin fibers that are intermingled with the clot, or sorry, with the platelet plug, and this is now what can be referred to as a clot. So in the end, well, we have sealed off the blood vessel. We no longer have the blood that is escaping to the outside. But in the end, what you really want to do is you want to completely remove that plug and that clot and completely fix that blood vessel. So if I go back to the beginning here, in the end, you want to repair this. You want that repaired and restored to its original condition, which means eventually, somewhere along the way, you need to also remove this clot here as well. It just so happens that there is also a clot dissolving enzyme, and it is called plasmin. It's originally in an inactive form called plasminogen. And then when it's activated, it can circulate around and it can dissolve the clot. In order to do that, there's another enzyme that activates this plasmin, and it is called tissue plasminogen activator. I'll just abbreviate it as TPA. Tissue plasminogen activator is going to activate the plasmin. Plasmin is going to dissolve the clot once the blood vessel has been repaired. So the final component of blood that we do need to talk about is the, well, usually the majority of the blood, and that is the plasma. So these numbers that we see here, again, they are kind of averages. As we saw, this is not necessarily the same percentage in every individual. If someone is living at altitude, if someone is an endurance athlete, then they would have a higher percentage, perhaps as high as 55%. If someone is a sedentary, or if someone has some sort of a genetic condition or a lack of iron in their diet, if they have anemia, in fact, it may be below 40%. But again, the average range for red blood cells, usually for most of the population, somewhere between 40 and 50% for the percentage of erythrocytes. For the white blood cells, again, that number can vary depending upon the person's health. If they are sick, the number will go up. If they're healthy, the number will be considerably lower. So white blood cells and platelets, usually less than 1%, but can be higher if the person is sick. The majority, though, is going to be the plasma, again, on average, as it says here, somewhere around 55%. And just like in a previous picture that we saw, it is kind of a pale yellowish color described as a straw color. And that's what we can see in this IV bag here as well. It's not just water, a whole bunch of things dissolved in it. So there are ions that are dissolved in it, like calcium and sodium and potassium and chloride that are in it. There are hormones that are circulating around in it. Remember that your digestive system, it breaks down your food, but then the monomers, the building blocks of what was broken down, it goes into the blood, and that's typically dissolved in the plasma. So the monosaccharides, the amino acids, the bases, and all of those do end up in the plasma. So think of it as a transport medium. It is transporting a whole bunch of things around. Yes, it's transporting the blood cells and the platelets, but it's also transporting a whole bunch of other things as well. So many of those things are nutrients. Also, some wastes can also be transported in the blood. Hormones, the signaling molecules in your body, they are transported using the blood. That is how they are transported from one part of the body to the other. Really important in terms of maintaining homeostasis. So the water content, the combination between water and salt and what is called osmotic pressure, that is maintained using the plasma. Your body temperature is maintained with your plasma as well, and also homeostasis in terms of acid base, ensuring that your body fluids, including your plasma, are relatively neutral, having a pH of about 7.